Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Author Series event with General Anthony Zinni. I'm Heidi Shoop, President of the World Affairs Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Tonight, the Council welcomes General Anthony Zinni. Our speaker is a retired Marine Corps general who, after retiring from active service in 2000, when he was Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Central Command in charge of all U.S. troops in the Middle East. That was the same job held by General Norman Schwarzkopf before him and General Tommy Franks after. Following his retirement, he was asked by the Bush administration to serve as Special Envoy to the Middle East peace process. While doing that, he also taught in the Department of International Studies at the Virginia Military Academy. He has served on the advisory boards of a number of companies, including that of BAE Systems, and has continued to teach leadership at the university level. As of this year, he is chairman of the Board of Governors of the Middle East Institute and has been named honorary chairman of that institution. He has continued to speak out on military and strategic issues and is the best-selling author of 4 books, including his first one, which he co-authored with Tom Clancy. Tonight, he will talk about his new book, Before the First Shots Are Fired: How America Can Win or Lose Off the Battlefield. This topic is particularly timely this evening, as once again America contemplates military action of unknown duration and expectation. General Zinni will take questions after his remarks. Just use this microphone off to your left. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General Anthony Zinni.
Well, thank you, Heidi, and thank all of you for coming out this evening. The book is not the one I started out to write. I, about 6 years ago, wanted to write a book about what our troops face in these kinds of conflicts ever since Vietnam, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and a number of others, because the conflicts, the character of the conflicts were so much different than maybe what the American people think about. And when they conjure up sending in our troops, I think they think more about the good war, the greatest generation, and this is a very confusing mess. I thought that really, if they understood what the troops confronted on the ground, they would understand better why it's more difficult to measure success or failure, to define military objectives and the like. As I got into the research of the book, I did an assessment in Iraq and Afghanistan after I retired for General Odierno in Iraq and General Allen, General Mattis in Afghanistan. And I looked at my own experiences, 2 tours in Vietnam, 3 in Somalia with the Kurds in northern Iraq, and a number of other commitments like that we were involved in. I started to realize more and more that the troops on the ground get it. More than likely, they adapt very well. I've always been a believer that it's Darwinian. It's not the smartest or the strongest. It's who can adapt the best. And when you're out there down at the level of the captain and the sergeant, you see how quickly at the village level they understand the nature of what they got to do. It doesn't seem to seep up, to the operational level, and it definitely doesn't get to the strategic and policy levels. During the course of writing this book, I talked to an ROTC unit, and I had one of the cadets ask me, when you were commander of U.S. Central Command, what was the most important thing you had to do? And I thought about that question for a while, and I realized as I thought more about it, my most difficult challenge and the thing that was most important for me to get right was to keep aligned the strategy, the policy and the politics, the operational design on the ground, and then the things that get done at the tactical level. And the more I thought about how it's almost natural that those things pull apart and how difficult it is to pull it together, the more I thought about men like George Marshall and others, that was their primary task, and they did it extremely well. They kept those things aligned. Marshall was as Churchill said, the architect of victory in World War II. So obviously he ensured that FDR, Churchill, the policy and the politic levels were matched up with a solid strategy. I mean, he was really the keystone to that strategy. And then he ensured at the operational level, the Eisenhowers and others out there were conducting operations in a way that met the political objectives. And if you read a lot about Marshall in his time, there were all sorts of things that could have pulled us off that. And then he was very interested in the preparation of our troops, the equipping of our troops, the tactical level. Would they be ready? We faced two formidable enemies, certainly more capable at the beginning of the war than the U.S. forces were. And so the more and more I looked at this, it wasn't the battlefield. It was what went on before the troops crossed the line of departure, and it was what went on while they were there fighting that most influenced whether we succeeded or not. So the book got more and more drift toward the strategic and political level and less toward the operational and tactical level. And there was one thing that triggered me to finally say, I'm going to talk about that level instead of the tactical level, and that was a comment made by former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. When Iraq was well underway and not going the way the predictions had all said it would, he was asked by a reporter, doesn't this look like Vietnam? And he really bristled at that comment, and he said, no war is like the last wars, and no war is like the next wars. All wars are different. And I thought about that and said, you know, obviously there are differences, but there's a heck of a lot of similarity. There is a pattern. And so the more and more I thought about that pattern, and again thinking about that pattern not so much from the battlefield, but from all the political wrangling, the lack of a strategy or a flawed strategy or a good strategy in some cases, the selection of leadership, the operational design we choose to implement on the ground and how that ties into the strategy, all these elements to me I thought were more important than anything in terms of determining success. For someone that spent 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, and in my experience, we won every battle and ended up losing a war, which was hard to stomach and understand for a young lieutenant and captain at the time. I really felt that this was important to talk about. And then I began to realize more and more, the American people probably don't understand that. If you go into Barnes & Noble, you're going to see a military history bookshelf that's replete with all the tales of battle and the things that go on in the battlefield. Very few books really talk about the things that go on off the battlefield and do so maybe in a very comprehensive way. So then I wanted to talk about the things that are the same, the pattern from conflict to conflict at that level, and I wanted to try to inform as much as possible people that don't understand all that stuff that goes on behind the scenes. I broke the book down into several areas. The first, I looked at what's triggered us to commit our military. What are the triggering events? I think most Americans have in mind, well, it's an attack on Pearl Harbor, it's 9/11, you know, it's something like that. Well, the vast majority of times it's something much more complicated, much more nuanced. It may be a red line, it may be a presidential doctrine that really sets the stage and, as I mentioned in the book, pre-plants the flag before we even go to war. Sometimes it's a Gulf of Tonkin incident that didn't happen, or WMD that wasn't there, you know, to bring it up more toward the current times. So the reasons for going to war are very, very much diverse and different, and not maybe what the American people think are clear-cut reasons. Tonight we're going to have a president that's going to address the American people. In the book, I talk about the battle of the narrative. It begins with what I call in there, and the name of the chapter is the My Fellow Americans speech. You know, when the president goes up and makes the case for war, makes the case for military commitment, has to demonstrate that there's an American interest involved or a threat to the U.S., and how significant is that threat. You know, so beside the triggering events, the next part of the book deals with how our presidents and our Congress, our political leadership, dealt with understanding what they were about to get into. And it has to do with the analysis. You know, it begins with the obvious. You know, the intelligence community comes in and briefs, but then presidents get advice because they're going to have to see options. How do they get those advice? How do they get that advice? Some presidents have had individuals that have had the preponderance of influence on the president. I mean, Wilson had his own single George House, Colonel George House, who was his advisor. We know about the Kissingers and Brzezinskis. There were some presidents like Eisenhower that formed a small group to advise him. In Eisenhower's case, it was a solarium group that he wanted in a very unique way. He structured it. He selected the people very carefully along with the Secretary of State. They met in the solarium room. When there was a crisis, they debated and discussed it. He wanted people with different views and opinions. He never asked a question. He never made a comment during this because he didn't want to influence them in any way. He took notes all the time. You know, we've had presidents that have relied on their cabinets, presidents that have relied on the National Security Council. So there's no set way to get advice. And sometimes the advice and the options presented at that stage aren't as robust or as fulsome or as diverse as maybe we would like to think. I was talking to a senior diplomat who I have a lot of respect for, and we were talking about how options get presented to the president. And he mentioned something about the options can be everything from a strong letter of protest to a 10 KT airburst somewhere. And so, you know, there's a range of things that if the president is interested, he could be presented with. But oftentimes, a president comes in predisposed toward a particular option, or there is someone or a small group that influences that president, and so there isn't that sort of robust debate or understanding in this phase. I will also say something about the intelligence. You know, I learned a lesson as a commander of CENTCOM that was taught to me by my director of intelligence, Army two-star, who I called in one day when I first got in the seat as the commander, and I asked him a question. And he said to me, you know, sir, can you tell me why you're asking me the question? And I said, no, just give me the answer. I got 4 stars, you got 2, you know, just do the math. And he said to me, you know, I'm your director of intelligence. He said, I can best serve you if I know why you're asking the question and what you're going to do with the answer. Because, believe it or not, you may be asking the wrong question. I may give you an answer, and that's not the right answer for what you intend to do. And that really hit home to me. That was a really great piece of advice going in at that level to command. And the key is, what kinds of questions do you ask of your intelligence community? You know, because that's going to show you what kind of answers you get back. Prior to my retirement, I'd become convinced that eventually Iraq was going to collapse. And if it collapsed, if Saddam Hussein was overthrown, would we be sent in? Now, certainly we'd go in if he attacked his neighbors or whatever. We were poised to do it, and basically those ultimatums were issued. And I wanted to know what a collapsed Iraq looked like. And so I brought together the entire intelligence community, representatives from the State Department, USAID, Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, everybody I could think of that might know something about this. We had a war game at Booz Allen Hamilton here in Washington. And I wanted the intelligence community to prepare the scenario so we could think through the moves we might make. I mean, I had a war plan to take down the regime and the Republican Guard. I had no war plan for what came afterwards. That was not a task we'd been given. That's not what the military does. Well, the intelligence community went on to describe this horrific situation of the ethnic groups and religious groups going at each other, the porous borders, if they're not controlled, all sorts of evil things coming in. It would be a mess. They predicted, this was 1999, everything that we encountered eventually when we went in 2003. Now, how come the intelligence community couldn't convey that to the administration that went in? Because if you remember, we were hearing, it'll be flowers in the street, it'll be a cakewalk, We don't need all those troops in the war plan. Shock and awe will win the day. And it was a complete disaster. So what happened? Were the right questions asked of the intelligence community? Did the intelligence community feel they had to give the answer the administration wanted? And so they didn't really give it as robust and descriptive as they gave to me? I don't know. But it shows you that necessarily that the intelligence isn't going to be exactly what it is from time to time. I did work on Iraq WMD after I retired. I was convinced toward the end of my tour that Saddam did not have an ongoing program. I was hearing this from the inspectors, UN and Atomic Energy, Mohammed al-Baradei and his organization. And when I did the work with the CIA, I did not see any credible evidence of an ongoing program. So how the heck do we have a WMD and an ongoing program as the casus belli, the reason to go in? So that part of it, the analysis, the intelligence, how you base it, what you base it on, the kind of advice you get at the senior leadership level, to me is critical at that point. The next stage, obviously, is the decision. And how do presidents make decisions? It's interesting as to what might be affecting them beyond just sort of hard, cold logic. I briefed President Clinton on military operations that we were conducting while he was mending fences with Mrs. Clinton at Camp David. And there was all sorts of things in the press, the wag the dog theory and everything else that went on. And, you know, I'm looking at somebody that's got a lot of emotional and other things on his mind as he's doing this and being accused by one side of the media saying he'll do this to distract attention and say go. And actually, it was already condition-based. It was already based on things that would happen and that already occurred. And another side saying, well, he won't do it. He's been too weakened now by this personal scandal. So what are these outside influences that come to a president? Did President Bush really want to get Saddam because he tried to kill his father, President H.W. Bush? I don't know. You know, so that decision that the president makes, you have a president tonight that really wanted to base his presidency on getting us disconnected from conflicts around the world. He wanted to be more like an Eisenhower president to focus on other things and, you know, restate our role and mission in the world. It's never come to that. It's never quite gotten there. He's about to give the most important speech of his presidency tonight to date, in my humble view. You know, so after that decision's made, the next step should logically be to create a strategy. Now, very, very few times in our history have we had a credible strategy. Sometimes we have had an overarching sort of grand concept of how we wanted to do business in the world. Certainly during the Cold War, deterrence, containment, that was our strategy. And we operated under it in different ways. Presidents like Kennedy, presidents like Truman, Eisenhower all had doctrines that were really statements of strategy. I would offer that since the end of the Cold War, we've stopped thinking strategically totally. We don't understand the world we're involved in for the last 25 years. We made no attempt. It seems to be too confusing. We don't understand our power and purpose. We have become transactional. We operate day to day and reactive. We have, you know, the statement the other night from the president saying, well, we don't have a strategy, so we need to figure one out. Now, if he really meant that, that's scary. If he confused the strategy with the military action plan, that's scary too. So I'm trying to be kind and figure out how he misstated that in some way, that he really didn't mean we don't have a strategy. You know, I listened to things like pivot to the Pacific. Really, Mr. President, how's that working for you right now? With the Ukraine and Europe, with the Middle East, with our own southern hemisphere, you know, I'll bet you a lot of attention is being given to the Pacific right now in the National Security Council and in the State Department and the Department of Defense, which shows maybe a naivete about the world and the need to state things in more global terms and not regional terms and not be reactive to what goes on. The creation of a strategy may be the most significant piece because the military can't do what it needs to do unless it knows what the strategy is. What are the political objectives? What is the end state? What are the resources you're willing to expend? You know, what are the political expectations? Because you can't fit a military plan. Again, align it to something if it isn't there. You know, a strategy can't be what we heard from the last administration, that we're just going to go pop the cork on a regime, and then it's flowers in the street and cakewalks, and it's a liberation, and it all self-orders. Few things in this world self-order. You know, there are no peace dividends, and there is no new world order that comes about without shaping it and influencing it in the way we did, say, post-World War II, with the Marshall Plan, 1947 National Security Act, creation of NATO, the World Bank. I mean, they were strategic thinkers. Again, back to the Kennans and the Marshalls that really thought that way. We don't have the Kennans and Marshalls today. Not that we don't have talented people that could be the Kennans and Marshalls. We don't value them and put them in positions where they could actually create this kind of meaningful understanding of the world and our power and purpose in it in some way. If you're lucky enough to get a strategy, let's assume we have one tonight, this is the next thing I talk about in the book. This is the battle of the narrative begins tonight. It's already begun in some ways, but tonight is the cornerstone. The battle of the narrative is your case that has to be made for this commitment of our military. And there are a number of audiences this president's going to have, just like past presidents. One audience is the American people. Another audience are potential allies and coalition mates in the international community. And the third audience is the enemy. He's got to address three audiences tonight. And some presidents have done this very effectively. Some have not done it very effectively. Some have done it because of the force of their ability to communicate. My daughter once said, you know, I'd like to believe my father's in the White House. She said, I don't mean that literally, not you, but I'd like to have a father image in the White House. Somebody that I feel good about, that, you know, that's in charge, everything's okay. And when I listen to that father in the White House, I understand that he knows what the heck he's doing. You know, so, and that's what I think that reflects how the American people want to feel about their president. They want to feel that's FDR in a fireside chat. You know, they want this kind of communication and understanding. They want to look into the president's eyes on that television or wherever and understand that he gets it and he understands what he's about to do and he's in charge. Now, that's got to come across. When I did the assessment in Afghanistan, I went around to the different staff sections for the ISAF, International Security and Assistance Force, the top command, and I was surprised to find a staff section I'd never run into before. This was the staff section that engaged in the battle of the narrative. There was a Navy admiral in charge, and he had all these slick messages. He was the guy who supervised the staff that did the messaging for the command. And it suddenly dawned on me, we've arrived at a different era now. I mean, I saw it my time before I retired, this was critical. You know, how you worked with the media, how you conveyed what you were about to do, how you kept the American people informed and all that, along with the spin that comes out of maybe the more senior elements above you. But right now we have messaging staffs down at these levels that are in charge of conveying some sort of signal as to what we're doing, whether it's spun or it's truthful or however it comes out. It tells you how powerful this is. This non-state entity that we have to deal with has got a pretty powerful social media narrative that they're involved in. Their recruiting seems to go well. They have their own target audiences. Once this is all in place and you're ready to go, you got to fall back on what you have ready to go. So one of the chapters I devoted is to the structure. What do we have out there? We have 4 services, 5th if you add the Coast Guard in times of war. You have 9 joint commands out there, the regional commands and functional commands. You have a structure. You have divisions, wings, logistics groups, and all kinds of component parts of what makes up a military. What's that based on? Well, during the Cold War, there was some measure. There was something to measure it against. There was a potential enemy that had an order of battle, and you had to be thinking to how you're going to be superior to that order of battle, either in quantity or quality. And fortunately, over time, during the Cold War, we were in quality and in thinking able to trump the former Soviet Union, and it collapsed. I think basically because it realized it couldn't keep up. And technological advances even more advanced and advantageous for our side than I think most Americans realize or know, some of which was never really even released, believe me, trust me. So there is something there that's got to be ready to go. Will that meet the bill? We obviously can't afford to have a kind of standing military that meets every contingency. It's unaffordable. And today, obviously, with a scrunched budget, it's even worse. Everybody remembers or quotes Eisenhower's military-industrial complex speech. At the time, Eisenhower, very few people that quote it actually read it, I find, because he starts out by explaining why we need in his words, our arms must be mighty, then goes on to, really wring his hands over how much it costs. Back then, it was over 50% of the federal budget, because this was the height of the Cold War. And I think a president that has domestic programs and other things going on is looking at this massive spending. Right now, it's a slightly less than 15% and sinking. So what's right? You might have an easier time demonstrating or expressing where the risks are that you take by not being able to fund everything, which we never would be able to do, then than you would now. Now it's very difficult because the threats are very nuanced and not as difficult, not as easy to measure in terms of order of battle. And so the kind of military you need now is difficult to define. So you go, as Rumsfeld said to that poor sergeant that said he was in the scrap heap in Kuwait trying to armor up his Humvee, he says you go to war with the army you got, not the one you want, or necessarily desire. And as crude as the statement was, it was made, and as harsh as it was, I think it could have been, it could have been better stated. But he was right. You go to war with the army you got. In this last conflict, we had to suddenly turn everything around to produce these MRAPs and other things because we suddenly found out how vulnerable many parts of what we had out there on the battlefield were. So there is a structure, and it's very difficult now to decide on that structure. The Goldwater Nichols Act, everybody knows and believes this had to deal with making our services more joint. People never talk about another element of the Goldwater Nichols Act. It requires the President of the United States to produce a strategy, a national security strategy within the first 150 days of his or her administration, and then to update it with the submission of the budget every year. Few presidents ever get to it in 150 days. Something gets put out eventually. It never gets updated. Goldwater Nichols intended that this go to Congress, that it be the basis for deciding what we fund, because obviously the power of the purse rests with Congress. I would defy you to find one senator or congressperson that has read the national security strategy, let alone use it as a basis to argue whether certain programs should or shouldn't be funded. It's usually, is it made in my district? Is it something I'm personally interested in? And the other part of this, too, in the structure is not just the pork, but it's the patronage. Who wears the suits and skirts that make these decisions in the Pentagon, in the National Security Council, in the State Department? How much military experience do they have? How much do they know? How much have they invested in their education? About every 4 years, we wash them all out. Even if presidential administrations go to a second term, about every 4 years, the major secretaries, assistant secretaries, and all go. How much of that appointment process and the scope of those appointments get made on political basis? How much did you give to my campaign? Rather than competence and expertise in the area. I took a group of military students that were involved in a planning course to the Pentagon. And we met with an assistant secretary there. And the assistant secretary, in his comments to the group, said, you military guys come in with all this, the elaborate planning process, all these steps. You want to brief me on this elaborate planning? I don't need all that. You just come in and sit at the table, and we just have a little discussion. We can move on from there. Well, I exploded. I said, you're the damn problem. You're going to go to war over a PowerPoint slide or a discussion when these guys are planning it down to a gnat's behind, and want to explain the details of what you might get into. So there's this big disconnect from the civilian leadership and how they do business, even in the agencies of government. For those of you that have served in the military, we have a planning culture. We plan everything to death. So when I'm there as the commander of U.S. Central Command, I've got my war plans. I look at my war plan. I know I can take down the regime. I know I can destroy the Republican Guard. And then what? You know, when I was a student at the National War College, we had a representative from Congress come over to talk to us. His name was Newt Gingrich. And he said, some of you are going to go on to greater responsibility. Wear stars. And we are political masters someday are going to tell you, go do this. He said, ask the question. And then what? You know, so the and then what question has to be answered tonight. Because if you put our military on the ground and they go in and they destroy ISIS or fight them or beat them back to Syria or whatever, and then what? You know, what comes after? What prevents ISIS from coming back? Or, you know, ISIS is born out of the ashes of AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. You know, and Al-Qaeda keeps metastasizing all over the world and comes up in different forms. Boko Haram, you know, they come up in Somalia. They come up in different places in different forms, the basic same extremist structure that they have. Once the president commits, then the military, working with that civilian leadership, has to create an operational design on the ground. It had better fit the strategy and the guidance and the policy and the politics. Now look what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. We were suddenly in search for a strategy because the one we thought we had, if we had any at all, was a disaster. All of a sudden we realized, uh-oh, not enough troops, surges. To do what? Has anybody got a good idea? Well, up pops a brilliant general officer, Dave Petraeus, who is brilliant. I knew Dave back when he was a colonel, and he was always marked as a future star. He had a plan, an operational design. He resurrected the counterinsurgency doctrine. So instead of just going out to get the SOBs that blew us up in 9/11, we are now rebuilding 9th century societies and advertising that will be Jeffersonian democracy, free market economy. Al-Qaeda is long gone out of Afghanistan, and we're still there. You know, Saddam, who I'm not sure what he ever did to us to cause us to go in, but we're still there, trying to clean up a mess that we probably triggered and blew up. You know, at the first entry into Iraq, I heard President Bush on the TV explaining why this was about the forces of democracy and freedom against the forces of oppression and dictatorship. I was sitting in the United Arab Emirates. I had two Arab friends of mine next to me. One of them nudged me and said, that's not about that. This is about Persian versus Arab. You have unleashed the devil we have tried to contain for centuries. The friend on the other side nudged me. He says, it's also about Shia versus Sunni. You have started a religious war we never wanted to have popped to the top. Now, who was right and who was wrong? All three were right. But did we understand clearly what we were about to do at the second, third order effects, you know, down to those levels? You know, and so did our military in there? I got a call from one of the commanders going into Iraq. They were about ready to launch. He said, do you have any last-minute guidance? I said, well, I have a question. Whose side are you on when the Civil War starts? Silence on the other end. He said, you don't really believe there's going to be a civil war? I said, you bet it. You know, it's going to be Kurd versus Arab, Sunni versus Shia, whatever, you know, get the Turkmens, the Chaldeans, the, you know, the Syrian Christians. There's a mess in there. And all the animosity that's been tamped down, if there isn't control, and you don't have enough troops to do it in this plan, and you're not controlling the borders, this place is going to come apart like a cheap suitcase. And if you don't understand that and you don't see it, and if the effort on the ground isn't matched up, I don't think the American people or our government understood counterinsurgency takes a heck of a lot more troops than we were politically willing to put on the ground. It costs a heck of a lot more. Do you think the administration that went in really thought we would have $2 trillion wars on our hands, that it would have the casualty rates that we suffered in this thing, that it would endure this long? The other part I mentioned in this chapter is about the selection of the leadership. When I went to Afghanistan to do the assessment, the war was in its 10th year. At that point, we had 10 commanders in 10 years. 10 commanders in 10 years. And you know, when I went around and saw the troops and talked to them about it, they said, every general with a good idea turns everything around. And at the whip end of that's that sergeant and captain down there. You know, the rules of engagement change, the operations change of where you're going or not going. Everybody gets whipped around. I had an Army Brigadier National Guard guy that had been there for a long time, really wise individual. And I was talking about this with him. He said, this has not been a 10-year war. This has been 10 one-year wars. Could you imagine changing out Eisenhower and Bradley and Nimitz in the middle of World War II? You know, so the way we manage the leadership, the way we change the operational design on the ground in search of something when there's a missing strategy and trying to fix it on the ground. And of course, the generals are saying you can't shoot shoot your way to victory, which is absolutely true. And then there's the metrics. How do we measure success? And we saw a president stand on the carrier and call mission accomplished. And we had a lot of fighting and mess way after that. You know, so what prompted mission accomplished? What was the measure of success? What was the objective? And again, that has to be up front. That's something we need to hear tonight, you know, because how do you know you're winning? When I was on the ground in Somalia, we were trying to figure out if we were winning. We actually went back to TRADOC, the Army's Doctrine Center, the Marine Corps' Doctrine Center, the Air Force, and said, help us. You know, we got thrown into here basically to put a security blanket over the humanitarian effort. Then the Pottery Barn theory kicked in. You break it, you own it. We now own Somalia. You know, I got a grandson that's banned from the Pottery Barn. I understand the concept. We now own the Somalia. And so what are we trying to do in Somalia? Well, let's try to create a police force. We're doing all sorts of things. How do we know we're winning? A couple of doctrine centers sent us over some indicators, low-intensity conflict indicators to know if you're winning. One of them was the price of weapons in the markets. There were arms markets that we kept trying to shut down. So the price of the weapon will tell you if you're winning. So we started tracking the price of an AK-47. And I had one of my staff come and tell me, sir, the price of an AK-47 is now $100. And so, you know, that tells us that we're very effective in getting rid of arms because the price has gone up to $100 for an AK-47. So the security situation is getting better. The price of weapons has gone up because maybe they're more scarce. Then another guy stand up and says, I don't think that's the case. I think that the security situation is so bad they're willing to pay more. You know, so I said, well, which is it? You know, I got this indicator, the price of a weapon, and now I hear it can be interpreted as good or bad, which are most of the indicators were that way. So we don't even know the metrics. It's easy when you're in a conventional conflict and you look at tanks destroyed and terrain taken and units that are defeated, but it's very difficult in this kind of environment. The last piece I have in the book is about outcomes, how conflicts end. And sometimes they may seem to end in a positive way or a satisfying way, but they set the stage for the next conflict. Charlie Wilson's war in Afghanistan. We were going to throw the Soviets out of Afghanistan, give them their Vietnam. You know, we did it, and we ended up with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. When I testified for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee why Iraq was a stupid move, and because of the plan, the lack of sufficient troops, and not understanding the aftermath, this was going to be a disaster. Actually had one senator say to me, I don't get it, General. Why are you so upset? We removed Saddam Hussein. What could be worse? Well, wait till tonight, and you'll find out. I'm glad to take any questions or comments you may have. And again, thank you for coming out.
My question is that you spoke about how basically go to war with the military you have, and the fact that we don't have a coherent current national security strategy. How is it then that the resource sponsors, the service chiefs, develop and budget for their militaries without that coherent strategy? How should they do that? And secondly, what should the service chief's role be in the development of a national security strategy? Thank you.
Well, think of the military in this way. There are three functions for a military. It is that has to be achieved to get the right kind of military. And remember the acronym PIE, P-I-E. The first is to provide. Clearly, Title 10, this is the job of the service chiefs. They provide. The second requirement is to integrate. You know, and we never did a great job of that. Goldwater Nichols has put us on the right track. We've gotten a lot better. but there needs to be an integration of capabilities. So we get the synergy and the effect and everything else that is beneficial from that. And then there's the E, the employment of the force. Now, we have a Rube Goldberg setup here. I used to, when I taught government at William & Mary, the other guy who taught the structure of government, when it came to the Pentagon, he used to ask me to come into the class and explain it. And I used to have to go up to the blackboard and I'd draw, well, this is the President, this is Secretary of Defense. Now, you have the service chiefs. You have the service secretaries, Army, Navy, and Air Force. Then you have the service chiefs, you know, Commandant, Chief of Staff, Army, Navy, Air Force, CNO. Then over here, under Secretary of Defense, you've got the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are under the Secretary. They're composed of the service chiefs who sit in as the Joint Chiefs. But really, they're not joint. Really, then the Secretary goes directly to these 9 combatant commanders, joint commands, out here. Well, by the time I finished, I can remember one girl raised her hand and says, Professor Zinni, you're not going to test us on this stuff, are you? I said, I never would. I mean, this is a plumbing chart you should forget. It was kludged together over time. I mean, to get to your point, you know, I'm sure a president that comes in or some political leader believes the Joint Chiefs of Staff embody all the knowledge and information I need about employing forces. They understand how to provide forces, how to build programs, because that's their day job. They suddenly put on something called the joint hat. They're no more joint than the man in the moon. It's not their fault. It's not been an effective advisory and strategy development body. Not the fault. We put the great people in there, the Omar Bradleys and the Colin Powells. But think about this. We created the Joint Chiefs of Staff after World War II. First war they faced was Korea. Truman kept telling them, go out there and fix the problem I have, which is MacArthur. He's off the reservation thing. They couldn't do it. They couldn't fix it. Truman had to go out and relieve him. The Joint Chiefs didn't serve him well. The next war they faced was Vietnam. Read H.R. McMaster's book, Dereliction of Duty. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were nowhere to be seen. Then you go to the Gulf War. Basically, we ignored the Joint Chiefs. One of them got relieved of duty for giving away classified material in a press brief, and they were irrelevant to Schwarzkopf. He wanted them out of the way. Then you go to the Iraq-Afghanistan business. Rumsfeld never even called a meeting of the Joint Chiefs to discuss the war, and the whole time, you know, the wars were going on. So that hasn't been an effective body. Now, we do a good job on the provide side, I think. You know, if we know what we want and need. But remember, who decides what we need? It's not the people who employ the force. You know, they always throw a bone out to the combatant commanders saying, well, give us your integrated priority list, or give us your high demand, low density list. We provide those lists all the time. Nobody does anything about them. You know, it's going to be what the service chiefs and Congress want. That's the structure you're going to go to war with. There's very little voice from the integrators and the employers on that end. I mean, my suggestion in the book is we create a different kind of Joint Chiefs of Staff. We take former combatant commanders and former service chiefs, create a mix of those in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have it be a standing body, because it should work on joint doctrine and it could work on strategy development, the military piece of this. You know, I think there's work for them. But unless you've got the P, the I, and the E involved, you don't now. It's all from the perspective of Washington and the P. And that's why the development of the strategy and the decisions don't reflect the need on the ground. That input doesn't get into this system. I don't think it was deliberate. It's just the way it evolved in those terms.
I was wondering, since tonight we're going to be getting the plan of what we're going to be doing with ISIS in the Middle East, I thought I would ask you about that. ISIS obviously is not a state. It does not have a formal military. They're fueled by an ideology. It is civilians or just regular people picking up guns and, you know, doing things. I was wondering, you said a lot about the important things about having a perfect, you know, a good strategy, and then also having clear things that indicate that you are succeeding in some kind of a conflict. What, if any, could there be with something like ISIS that's so hard to track down?
Right. Well, I think in the case of ISIS, first of all, they're aspirational in terms of wanting that army and that state. You know, they're not going to get it. I mean, yeah, let's be clear. But they are aspirational. They want to do that. Obviously, the first mission for us is to ensure those things don't happen, because these are thugs. I mean, that's basically what they are. They're extremists, they're thugs, they're radical, they're fringe. When you look at the overall numbers, they recruit well of disenfranchised youth. They have a great message. But really, when put it in perspective, if you probably in your wildest dreams, there's maybe 10,000 of them, and there may be of varying degrees of support and competence. Many of them are composed of disenfranchised Iraqi military. When we disbanded the military, which we spent 10 years communicating to the Iraqi military that when the time comes, we won't disband you, we'll keep paying you. And then the first thing they do in the CPA is disband them. You know, after 10 years of CENTCOM communicating back channel to them, dropping leaflets on them, that sort of thing. So what needs to be done with ISIS? First of all, get them the heck out of Iraq. They've been in there for 3 months. They control the second largest city, and we're sitting around contemplating our navels here. I mean, 2 brigades of U.S. military could have them out in a heartbeat with air support and cover. So we've allowed them to fester. We've allowed them to dig in. We've allowed them to commit atrocities, near genocide, and obviously the horrific things that we see going on. We see the Americans. They're cutting the throats of Lebanese military that they've captured one at a time. They have about 40 of them, and they hold Turkish and other hostages too. So this is unacceptable on an international level, on a moral level, or that's something we could. I hope we would never tolerate genocide again and this kind of horrific behavior. So the first step is get them out of Iraq. The second step is to ensure they don't have a sanctuary. And if that means bombing in Syria and special operations missions and a lot of intelligence focus, signals intelligence and human intelligence and others to pick out the targets to keep them off balance, one lesson we should have learned over and over again: do not give extremists a sanctuary. You know, the Al-Qaeda had Afghanistan, Somalia became a sanctuary for al-Shabaab, and this creates a problem. You've got to remove the sanctuary. Now, when I use the term we, I'm not just talking about the United States and all this. Once they're out of Afghanistan, you've got to look at the root causes that'll let them get in there. And it was the Maliki government that wasn't inclusive enough to ensure the Sunnis were brought into the government in meaningful ways, that there was a sharing of resources and a delegation of authority. When I did my assessment in Iraq, Maliki had just come into office. Everybody I talked to in our own embassy, our generals, and even the ministers in the Iraqi government were all saying the same thing. If Maliki doesn't really develop an inclusive government, if he doesn't reach out, if he doesn't share authority and resources, this is going to go down. It was prophetic. I mean, that's what happened. So that has to be fixed. Now, we got him out. We got a new government in. I know Secretary Curry's right there right now, I think, reading the Riot Act and looking to fix that, because that's the way you got to build confidence in the Sunni population. So let's talk about where Iraq goes from here. Iraq, I think, is going to have to evolve in maybe a different way than we envision. Let's say more along the model of the United Arab Emirates, where you have 3 emirates. One of the Kurds, who do extremely well, reached out to the West, are everybody's favorite people. They'll do extremely well. There's going to be a degree of autonomy they're going to retain and insist on. The Shia in the south, obviously close ties with Iran. The majority, they have a sponsor. They'll be fine. The Sunnis are the big problem. Now, I think if you created a separate entity there under some loose federation, and the third entity were the Sunnis, their godfather can be Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, other places in the south that have a religious affinity and could help support them. So you would have a federation or confederation, or however you want to match it. So there would be some sort of federal system with powers, certain powers delineated to go to the federal government, a basic sponsorship to ensure stability in some way. Now, I'm not saying this is the answer. I'm just giving you an example of how to be creative to match the facts on the ground. I mean, Sykes-Picot created all this crap that we're dealing with now, and it still haunts us to this day. The other part of this, what I hope we hear tonight, is what kind of coalition and alliance are we building? It's going to have to come in 2 parts. There has to be this international piece, mostly European, but others that could contribute, much like the first Gulf War. That would, and I would hope we're expanding this beyond just military contributions too, because I think it's going to take more than that. And then and we should lead that. Then you're going to have to build, much like we did in the Gulf War, a regional coalition. And remember, they insisted on their own command structure. Prince Khalid was in charge of that structure. That's fine. And it could be more of a, not just a military piece, maybe formed around the GCC and GCC plus, countries like Egypt and Jordan, and have another component, maybe some sort of diplomatic component, or some other component that helps work with the governance in the region, economic systems, or whatever. So I think you're going to need to build two coalitions. You can't give sanctuary. You're going to have to commit to making sure that they're not able to have the safety of Syria to plan and regroup and refit and recruit and do everything they need to do to come back. Now, here's the weak link in all this right now to me. It's the ground force. Because right now we're going to try to do this with the Peshmerga, who are good fighters, but not a lot of them and never been properly equipped. We can remedy that. The Iraqi military, who are questionable at best right now. We hope they stand up. Maybe, and it's a mixed bag of Shia militias and others in there. And then the Free Syria moderates. And they've got a fight on their hand with Assad. How do you piece that together to have sort of the military ground force? Our air power can only do so much. Special ops, and special forces advising them and helping calling in, it can only do so much. And so the weak link in this right now, in my mind, is that force you need to push them out initially, then to hold what you have, then to be able to resist them if they should try to come back in some form. But I would hope at that time we're depleting them inside Syria too. So coalition building, Iraqi governance and the system it's going to have, building the right kind of military structure and support, ensuring no sanctuary. I would say in the shorthand, those need to be key pieces of what we hear tonight in terms of a strategy.
Thank you. Those key pieces are partly an answer to what I want to ask you. I'm Diane Pearlman. I'm at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. And also I want to thank you very much for your wisdom and the depth of your understanding. And we need more of that, and I hope you're putting it out. Attracts more of that in the field. And before we invaded Iraq in 2003, I was at the Center for Study of Ethnopolitical Conflict in Philadelphia, and I had colleagues meeting with Senator Arlen Specter, and I was writing pieces. We were writing pieces on emergency warning, predicting basically everything that would happen that happened. So as you say, that all of this is predictable and preventable. And one voice that I find missing a lot is the field, people in my field, which I hold responsible, field of conflict analysis, social science, and, their studies of radicalization are becoming more understood, and we understand more about root causes, just grievances, legitimate goals. And I'm a little bit worried about, it seems like in the media that we're a little catching on a little bit, I hear a little bit about understanding about, the Sunnis, and what happened to how they were alienated and what drives people, and we need to have something that attracts Sunnis. So I'm a little bit worried about what, tonight there's also a public clamoring for a lot of there's a lot of say concrete, black and white thinking, going after bad guys, physically removing them rather than dealing with the underlying causes. So you partially answered that, but I wondered if there are more voices talking to the administration and also communicating to the public understanding, because I'm a little bit worried of deepening the escalation.
Yeah, I think you get to a very important point, and that's the root causes. I think we have to do more to understand the radicalization of the youth. What are the conditions? How does the radicalization process go? That requires intelligence, cultural understanding. I mean, even for those that are recruited from communities like here in Great Britain and elsewhere, I think conflict resolution, I've done 8 peace missions around the world, not just the Israeli-Palestinian. I did in Sumatra with the Free Aceh movement, in Mindanao with the Muslim Islamic Liberation Front. I've spent a lot of time with rebel groups in the jungle, I can tell you. I did some in Africa. I'm now pursuing another master's degree in conflict resolution at Creighton, So when you're a 71-year-old student, the other people look at you like, why? you know.
Well, thank
But-
you. We need you badly. Yeah.
Well, you know, so the reason I have a passion for it and understanding, I want to go back to the point I said about options. You know, I've seen organizations that, many NGOs out there. I worked with the Henri Dunant Center in Geneva, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, with the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, Norway, with Intermediate, which is in the UK and London-based that does that, and a number of other organizations. I work with the U.S. Institute of Peace in the Philippines to do one of the things you mentioned, to research claims, to ancestral domain and other things, to put on the table, and the mediation goes down, the case or the cases for the parties too. We don't invest enough in that. I'll tell you another problem I see. We sort of have this assumption if you're a diplomat, you're a mediator. That's not true. I mean, since you're involved in that, mediation is a very different skill than just diplomacy, and it isn't automatically a subset. And we have not developed the capability to work that. You can see it on the ground. I mean, even at the operational and tactical levels. We had our military doing this in Iraq and Afghanistan, trying to heal tribal differences and ethnic differences and religious differences with nowhere near the skill sets or the understanding, certainly the will to do it and understanding the need. So this is a whole area that I think, I want to go back to my point, a whole of government and the way we need to invest across the spectrum of our power. This is one we could develop very easily. And, you know, it's very satisfying when you see something, you avoid violence or you remove violence because you're able to find a remedy, you know, through some sort of mediation process. And I think we've got, you know, the Congress wants to cut funding for U.S. Institute of Peace. There's no value in that whole field, I think, in State Department anyway, in getting specialization. You know, so it's frustrating when you're trying to work that. It's become such a sophisticated form now in how you do it. Sometimes a government, like us and the Israeli-Palestinian, it may be the necessary mediation. Sometimes an international or regional body, like the United Nations or a regional organization. Sometimes it's a PVO, private volunteer organization, or an NGO that has no political basis, and so it's more easily accepted out there. And when you bring people to the table, how do you bring up their negotiation skills? When we did this with the Free Aceh movement, we brought in Bill Urey, you know, getting to yes, getting past no, to help them because they're now in a room with seasoned diplomats, and it's intimidating. So how do you balance that? Doing cross-cultural mediation is an interesting phenomenon. You know, I always wanted to see the Israelis and the Japanese negotiate because one is blunt and very forward, the other is form and is more important than substance. And so those kinds of cross-cultural mediations, too, are critical to understand and how you find the bridges to do that. So I take your point. In my mind, it goes to the kit bag the president needs when you're giving him options as to what to do. Can you stop it in its tracks before it gets that far? That's sure a far less investment than what it's going to take if you have to go kinetic. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.